For over 5 centuries, one city controlled something every household in Europe desperately wanted, and most people never even knew who was charging them for it. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. In medieval Europe, these weren't luxuries. They were essential for preserving food, for medicine, for masking the taste of meat that had gone slightly off during a winter with no refrigeration. And for centuries, if you wanted spices in Europe, you bought them from Venice. There was no other option. This is the story of how a city built on water became the financial center of the medieval world, and how a single new trade route destroyed everything it had built in less than a generation. Venice's origin story is almost improbable. A collection of mudflat islands in a lagoon at the northern end of the Adriatic Sea, settled, according to tradition, by refugees fleeing the chaos of the collapsing Roman Empire in the 5th century. The location was defensible but barely habitable. No farmland, no natural resources, no rivers to bring goods from the interior. The only thing Venice had was access to the sea, and its people learned, over generations, to make that everything. The key relationship, in Venice's early centuries, was with the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, the richest city in the medieval world, sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and Venice positioned itself as its Western commercial partner. In 1082, Venice extracted one of the most valuable commercial agreements in medieval history from the Byzantine emperor, near total exemption from trade taxes throughout the empire. Venetian merchants could trade across the entire Byzantine world, free of the duties that crippled their rivals. Venice invested its growing wealth in infrastructure. The arsenal, the state shipyard, became one of the most efficient industrial facilities in the medieval world, capable of producing a fully equipped warship in a single day at its peak. In 1204, Venice pulled off one of the most audacious financial maneuvers in history. When the Fourth Crusade needed ships to reach the Holy Land, Venice agreed to provide them for a price. When the Crusaders couldn't pay, Venice redirected the entire crusade to sack Constantinople instead, and claimed a quarter of the Byzantine Empire for itself. Venice emerged from the crusade with island colonies, ports, and trading posts stretching across the eastern Mediterranean, the infrastructure of a commercial empire. At the heart of this empire was the spice trade. The route was extraordinarily long. Spices traveled from the islands of Southeast Asia, through India, across the Arabian Sea, through Egypt and the Levant, and then at the end of the chain into Venetian hands. By the time pepper reached a market in Paris or London, it had passed through a dozen sets of hands, and Venice controlled the final, most profitable stage. Venetian merchants bought spices in bulk in Alexandria or Beirut, and sold them to northern European merchants at enormous markups. The profits were staggering. Venice used them to build a city of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Palaces, churches, libraries, the institutions of a functioning republic that had no parallel in medieval Europe. Venice also pioneered financial instruments that the modern world still uses: letters of credit, marine insurance, double-entry bookkeeping, early forms of banking. Many of the foundations of commercial capitalism were developed or refined in Venice. By the 14th century, Venice was arguably the most commercially sophisticated city in the world. Its population was around 100,000, enormous by medieval standards. Its merchant fleet was the largest in Europe. Its trade network reached from England to the Black Sea. Then, in 1453, something happened that would change the balance of power across the entire Mediterranean world. The Ottoman Turks besieged and captured Constantinople. For Venice, this was an existential challenge. The Ottomans now controlled the eastern Mediterranean routes that Venetian trade depended on. But Venice was nothing if not pragmatic. It negotiated trade agreements with its new neighbors, adapting rather than collapsing. It had survived Genoese rivalry, plague, and political upheaval for centuries. Surely it could survive a change in who controlled the eastern ports. What Venice couldn't survive was something far more fundamental. In 1498, a Portuguese fleet commanded by Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India by sea. For the first time in history, European ships could sail directly to the source of the spices, bypassing the entire chain of middlemen that Venice had spent centuries positioning itself to control. The news reached Venice like a slow-moving earthquake. At first, merchants dismissed it. The Portuguese route was longer. The ships were different. Surely the established system would hold. It didn't hold. Venetian spice imports, which had run at roughly 1,600 tons per year in the late 15th century, collapsed to less than 500 tons within the first decade of the 16th century. The Portuguese were undercutting Venetian prices by buying directly at the source. Venice tried to adapt. It shifted toward luxury goods, glass, textiles, publishing. The famous Venetian glass industry expanded. The city became a center of early printing, but none of these could replace the extraordinary profits of the spice monopoly. At the same time, Venice was fighting expensive wars to defend what remained of its Mediterranean empire. Cyprus was lost to the Ottomans in 1571, after a brutal conflict that drained the treasury and exhausted the fleet, even as Venice claimed a famous naval victory at Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto is remembered as a great Christian victory. Venice, Spain, and the papacy destroying the Ottoman fleet. But within 2 years, Venice had negotiated a separate peace with the Ottomans, surrendering Cyprus permanently. The victory had cost more than it gained. Meanwhile, the center of global trade was shifting permanently westward. The Atlantic was becoming the new Mediterranean, and Venice had no Atlantic coast, no Atlantic colonies, and no realistic way to compete with powers whose geography now gave them the advantage. By the early 17th century, the Dutch East India Company had entered the spice trade, with a corporate structure, a state-backed monopoly, and military force that made even the Portuguese look like amateurs. Venice was now competing not just with one Atlantic power but with several. The decline was not a sudden crash. Venice remained wealthy, cultured, and sophisticated well into the 17th and 18th centuries, but it was no longer growing. Its population stagnated. Its merchant fleet shrank. Its financial innovations were now being copied and surpassed by Amsterdam and London. In its final centuries, Venice became famous for something entirely different from trade pleasure. Carnival, opera, painting, the grand tour. It became the city wealthy Europeans visited for entertainment rather than for business. The end came, finally, not through economic collapse but through military force. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte marched his army to the edge of the lagoon and issued an ultimatum. The Republic of Venice, which had survived for over 1,000 years, surrendered without a fight. The last Doge resigned. The Great Council met for the final time. The republic that had outlasted the Byzantine Empire survived the Black Death and negotiated with crusaders and sultans simply ended, without war, without siege, just a vote and then silence. Venice was handed to Austria as part of Napoleon's diplomatic arrangements. The city that had once controlled the trade of an entire world became a provincial backwater in someone else's empire. What killed Venice? Not war, not plague, not even the Ottomans, who coexisted with Venice for centuries. What killed Venice was geography, specifically, the fact that the world's most important trade route moved, and Venice couldn't move with it. For nearly 5 centuries, Venice's location, at the western end of the Mediterranean, ideally placed to receive goods from the East and distribute them to Europe, was its greatest asset. When the Atlantic became the dominant trade axis, that same location became irrelevant. Venice couldn't build an Atlantic port. It couldn't reposition itself geographically. It could adapt its products, and it did, but it couldn't replicate the fundamental structural advantage that the spice monopoly had provided. This pattern, a dominant commercial power controlling a critical choke point, then losing its advantage when the route changes, has repeated throughout history. The cities of the Silk Road, Samarkand, Bukhara, were once among the wealthiest in the world. The railway and the steamship bypassed them. They declined within a generation. Countless ports and trading cities have risen and fallen on the same logic. Whoever controls the route controls the wealth. When the route moves, the wealth moves with it. But Venice's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale. The financial instruments it developed, credit, insurance, debenture accounting, survived the decline of the city that invented them and became the foundation of modern capitalism. Amsterdam, the city that replaced Venice as Europe's commercial capital in the 17th century, built directly on Venetian foundations. The Dutch East India Company used Venetian-style financial instruments, adapted, expanded, and eventually made global. And the city itself, the physical city, survived. Its buildings, its art, its canals. The palaces that trade built are still there, now full of tourists rather than merchants. Venice today faces a different kind of slow decline, rising waters, a shrinking permanent population, an economy built almost entirely on the visitors who come to see what remains of the city that commerce built. There is something quietly melancholy about it. The pepper that was once worth its weight in silver, that funded fleets, built palaces, and financed a republic that lasted 1,000 years, now costs almost nothing. You probably have some in your kitchen right now, without giving it a second thought. That's the nature of monopolies built on roots rather than on things. When the root changes, the power evaporates, and what was once priceless becomes cheap, and what was once powerful becomes a museum. Venice lasted longer than almost any commercial empire in history. It was more flexible, more sophisticated, and more durable than almost any rival. And it still wasn't enough. Once the world's trade routes simply moved somewhere it couldn't follow. The lesson isn't that Venice failed. The lesson is that it succeeded brilliantly for 5 centuries, and that even the most successful commercial empires are ultimately at the mercy of geography, technology, and the direction the world decides to move. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, he wasn't trying to destroy Venice. He was simply trying to reach India. The consequences for the city that had controlled the route for centuries were enormous and entirely unintended. History's most consequential disruptions often work this way. Nobody sets out to destroy the dominant power. They simply find a better route, a cheaper method, a new technology, and the incumbent, however powerful, finds it has nothing left to sell that the world can't get elsewhere. The Republic of Venice lasted from 697 to 1797, over 1,100 years. No commercial republic in history has come close to matching that record, and it ended not with a bang but with a vote in a council chamber on a spring afternoon in May. After 1,000 years of independence, the last Doge reportedly said, as he handed over power, "I will not be the last Doge of Venice." He was wrong. But you can understand why he couldn't quite believe it. If you made it this far, leave a comment. What modern city or industry do you think is in the same position Venice was in 1490? Dominant, prosperous, and about to be bypassed by a route it never saw coming. A city built on water by people with no land and no resources, who turned geography into a monopoly and a monopoly into an empire. What they built lasted 1,000 years. What ended it wasn't an army. It was a ship rounding a cape on the other side of the world.